Blood smells like copper and old pennies, but hospital politics smell like cheap lavender lotion and exhaustion. They thought I was just a float nurse, a temporary ghost covering lunch breaks and messy bedpans. Then the Black Hawks rattled the glass, and heavily armed men started screaming for Dusty. Fluorescent lights don't buzz, they hum. It's a low abrasive frequency that burrows behind your eyes around hour 10 of a 12-hour shift. I was standing in Bay 4 of Mercy General's emergency department, holding a plastic basin full of vomit, trying to isolate that hum so I wouldn't have to listen to Nancy. Nancy was the charge nurse. She wore scrubs the color of bruised plums and clogs that sounded like a heavy gavel striking the linoleum. "You're floating today, Harper," Nancy said, not looking up from her tablet. Her tone was the exact pitch reserved for nursing students and broken medical equipment. "I know they had you up in neuro step down yesterday, but we had a call out. Don't touch the central lines. Just do vitals cleanup and keep the board green. Leave the heavy lifting to my core staff." "Understood," I said. My voice was flat, deliberately flat. I dumped the basin into the hopper, hit the flush valve, and let the smell of institutional bleach sear the back of my throat. It masked the smell of the vomit, but only just. I didn't care about the insult. You don't take a job as a float nurse if you have an ego. You take it because you want to be invisible. You belong to no unit. You attend no staff meetings. You don't get invited to the secret Santas, and nobody asks about your weekend. You show up, you plug the holes in the sinking ship, and you clock out. It was exactly what I wanted. I spent 6 years making decisions that decided who got to breathe and who got to bleed out in the dirt. Now I just wanted to empty bedpans and be told I wasn't qualified to flush an IV. I walked out of the sluice room drying my hands on a scratchy paper towel. The ER was locked in its usual mid-morning chaos. The air was thick with the scent of rubbing alcohol, stale sweat, and the faint sweet decay of diabetic ketoacidosis from Bay 2. Alarms chimed in a disjointed, erratic rhythm. To the civilian staff, it was a war zone. To me, it was a waiting room. Dr. Chen, a second-year resident who still looked like he needed his mother to pack his lunches, was hovering over a patient in Bay 6. An 80-year-old man with a fractured pelvis from a fall. Chen was frantic, his hands visibly shaking, as he tried to secure a peripheral line in an arm that looked like translucent parchment. The monitor was dinging. Blood pressure was bottoming out. I watched from the nurse's station. Nancy was on the phone arguing with a lab tech about a lost blood sample. 2 other core nurses were huddled around a computer complaining about the cafeteria menu. Chen missed the vein. A small bloom of dark blood pooled under the old man's skin. The resident cursed under his breath, wiping at the sweat on his forehead with the back of a gloved hand. He was losing the window. The patient's skin was taking on that distinct waxy pallor, the color of old soap. I felt a familiar, unwelcome twitch in my fingers. Muscle memory. The urge to shove him aside, grab an intraosseous drill, and punch a line straight into the bone. Fast. Brutal. Effective. Instead, I walked over my rubber-soled shoes, squeaking softly on the sticky floor. I didn't say a word. I just reached into the cart, grabbed a pediatric butterfly needle, and gently tapped the back of the patient's hand. Chen looked up, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger. "I've got this," he snapped. "I don't need a float." "You're blowing his veins, doctor," I said. My voice was barely a whisper. I didn't look at him. I looked at the old man's hand, feeling the subtle, sluggish roll of a vein between the metacarpals. "Hold his wrist. Keep it taut." Chen hesitated, his pride warring with his panic. Panic won. He held the wrist. I slid the needle in. A tiny, perfect flash of crimson filled the chamber. I taped it down fast, connected the saline flush, and pushed. Smooth. No resistance. Fluids are wide open, I said, stepping back into the shadows before Chen could even process what had happened. You might want to order a cross-match. His abdomen is rigid. Pelvis fractures hold a lot of hidden blood. I didn't wait for his thank you, mostly because I knew I wouldn't get one. I walked back to the break room. The coffee in the carafe looked like used motor oil, and it tasted worse. I poured a cup anyway, letting the heat burn the roof of my mouth. I sat in the corner chair, the vinyl cracking under my weight, and closed my eyes. I was so tired. It wasn't the kind of tired that sleep fixes. It was a bone-deep exhaustion, a residue left over from a life I had boxed up and buried. My left knee throbbed a dull ache where a piece of shrapnel had permanently rearranged my cartilage in a province I never wanted to think about again. I rubbed my eyes. Just a float nurse. I repeated it to myself like a mantra. You are just a float nurse. You don't matter. You are safe in the shallow end of the pool. The break room door swung open. Nancy stood there, her hands on her hips, her face pinched into a scowl. Harper, break's over, she snapped. Bay 3 needs a cleanup, and when you're done, stock the isolation carts. The real nurses are busy. I took one last sip of the terrible coffee. On it, the vibration didn't start in the air. It started in my teeth. It was 1,400 hours. I was elbow deep in the isolation cart, counting out N95 masks. I paused. The plastic wrapper crinkled in my grip. I swallowed hard, feeling a sudden cold knot form in the pit of my stomach. Civilian medevac helicopters, the shiny red and white ones that land on hospital roofs, have a high, frantic whine. They chop the air lightly. This was not a civilian bird. This was a heavy, rhythmic thud. Thump, 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 thump. It resonated through the concrete pillars of the building, vibrating the loose ceiling tiles. It was the sound of an MH-60M Black Hawk. The sound of a fully loaded armored machine displacing a massive amount of air. And by the sound of the syncopated resonance, there wasn't just one. There were two, maybe three. I dropped the masks. In the ER, the civilian staff was oblivious. The monitors continued to beep. Nancy was yelling at someone over the intercom. They couldn't feel it yet, but I could. My pulse kicked up a traitorous spike of adrenaline flushing through my veins. My hands perfectly steady when dealing with a dying octogenarian began to tremble. I shoved them into my scrub pockets and backed up against the wall. No, not here. Not my problem. Then the red phone at the charge desk rang. It never rings. It's a direct line to county dispatch for mass casualty events. Nancy stared at it for a full 3 seconds before picking it up. Mercy ER, what? Her voice lost its sharp edge, instantly dissolving into a reedy panic. Wait, you can't land here. We're a level 3. We don't have the trauma surgeons on standby for... She stopped. Whoever was on the other end wasn't asking for permission. The heavy thudding grew deafening. The double doors at the ambulance bay rattled violently on their hinges. Dust and dry leaves blew past the frosted glass. Code yellow, Nancy shrieked, dropping the phone. Everyone code yellow, clear the trauma bays. We have incoming. They're bypassing admin. They're landing in the lot. The ER erupted. It was a chaotic, disorganized scramble. Nurses crashed into each other, pulling crash carts. Dr. Chen looked like he was going to throw up. Even the attending physician, an older guy named Dr. Aris, who usually moved at the speed of molasses, was sprinting down the hall. "Harper," Nancy yelled, pointing a shaking finger at me. "Get out of the way, stand against the wall. Do not touch anything in the trauma bay." I didn't argue. I pressed my back against the cool plaster, my heart hammering against my ribs. I wanted to run. I wanted to walk out the back door, get in my beat-up Honda, and drive until the road ran out. The smell of aviation fuel was seeping through the ventilation system, mingling with the bleach and the sickness. It smelled like Afghanistan. It smelled like failure. The ambulance bay doors didn't just open, they were kicked open. 4 men surged into the pristine, brightly lit ER. They looked like an alien species among the pastel scrubs and white coats. They wore filthy, sweat-stained tactical gear plate carriers strapped tight over combat shirts. Dust and sand, real sand, not the dirt from the hospital flower beds, clung to their boots. They moved with a terrifying synchronized aggression. They were carrying a Stokes litter. "Clear the fucking way," the lead operator roared. His voice was a gravel pit. He didn't have a weapon drawn, but his mere presence was a threat. He shoved a gurney aside with one hand, sending it crashing into a wall. "Bay 1, move," Dr. Aris yelled, trying to sound authoritative, but his voice cracked. The operators ignored him. They hoisted the litter onto the nearest empty bed in the open floor, disregarding the sterile trauma bays entirely. I stayed pinned to the wall, trying to control my breathing. I could see the man on the litter. His uniform was shredded. His left leg ended abruptly below the knee, a makeshift tourniquet twisted so tight into his thigh that it was cutting into the muscle. But that wasn't what was killing him. It was his chest. A massive gaping wound just below the collarbone bubbling with pink froth. Tension pneumothorax. His trachea was deviating to the right. He had minutes, maybe less. "We need to get him to surgery," Dr. Aris yelled, rushing forward with Chen in tow. "We need blood, O negative massive transfusion protocol. Let me see that chest wound." The lead operator, a massive guy with a ragged beard and a patch on his shoulder that I recognized with a sickening jolt, stepped directly into Dr. Aris's path, putting a heavy-gloved hand on the doctor's chest. "Back off," the operator snarled. "I am the attending physician." Aris protested, though he shrank back from the sheer physical mass of the man. "He's dying. He needs a chest tube. He needs—" "You're a civilian who sets broken arms," the operator said, his eyes scanning the terrified faces of the ER staff. The room was dead silent, save for the ragged, wet breathing of the dying man on the bed. The operator's gaze swept over the huddle of nurses. He looked past Nancy. He looked past the crash carts. "Where is she?" he demanded. Nancy swallowed hard, stepping forward nervously. "Sir, I am the charge nurse. If you tell us what unit you're with, I can contact the VA or the military liaison." "Shut up," the man snapped. He turned in a slow circle. "I know she's in this hospital. Dispatch tracked her license." My stomach dropped into a bottomless abyss. No. I held my breath. I tried to blend into the plaster behind me. I was wearing generic blue scrubs. My hair was pulled back in a messy bun. I was a ghost. The operator took a deep breath, the smell of copper and death radiating off him. He looked directly into the crowd of cowering medical professionals and roared. "Where is Dusty?" The name hung in the air. A phantom. A relic from a life I thought I had burned to the ground. Nobody moved. Nobody knew who Dusty was. To them, I was Harper, the float nurse, the girl who cleaned up the vomit. The man on the bed seized a brutal full-body arch. The bubbling in his chest worsened. Another operator holding pressure on the stump of the man's leg looked up with wild, desperate eyes. "Wyatt, he's crashing. He's losing his airway." Wyatt, the giant with the beard, looked panicked. Actual raw panic breaking through the tactical discipline. "I need whiskey 6, Wyatt screamed at the room, his voice cracking. "I need dust-off actual now." I closed my eyes. The hum of the fluorescent lights faded, replaced by the ghost of a rotor blade, the memory of screaming engines, and the smell of hot sand. I didn't want to do this. I was so tired. If I stepped forward, the ghost was dead. Harper, the float nurse, would cease to exist. The man on the bed let out a horrific, rattling gasp. I opened my eyes. I looked at my hands. They had stopped shaking. I pushed off the wall. My rubber soles didn't squeak this time. I walked past Nancy, who was staring at the men in wide-eyed terror. I walked past Dr. Chen, who was frozen in place. I walked right up to the giant named Wyatt. He looked down at me, his eyes wide, recognizing the posture, if not the face. "Move," I said. My voice wasn't flat anymore. It was sharp, cold. It was a scalpel. Wyatt stepped back instantly, deferring to the tone. I looked down at the dying man. I didn't see a patient. I saw a puzzle that was rapidly falling apart. "He needs a needle decompression, right fucking now," I said, my hands moving, before my brain even registered the commands. I didn't look at the doctors. I looked at Nancy. "Nancy," I barked a command that echoed off the linoleum. "Get me a 14-gauge angiocath, a scalpel, and a chest tube tray. Skip the betadine. Just give it to me." Nancy blinked, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. You're not authorized to..." I didn't yell. I didn't have to. I just looked at her, letting 6 years of combat trauma stare back into her terrified civilian eyes. "Bring me the tray, Nancy," I whispered, "or he dies on my floor and I break your fingers." Nancy ran. Nancy practically threw the plastic tray onto the edge of the bed. She was hyperventilating, her eyes darting between the armed men and the blood pooling on the linoleum. I ignored her. I ignored Dr. Aris, sputtering something about liability. My hands tore open the sterile packaging of the 14-gauge angiocath. It wasn't sterile anymore, not in this room, not with the dust and sweat falling off the operators, but it didn't matter. Infection kills you in 3 days. Tension pneumothorax kills you in 3 minutes. I found the second intercostal space on the right side of the soldier's chest, right along the mid-clavicular line. His skin was clammy cold to the touch and stretched tight like a drum over his ribs. "Hold him down," I ordered. Wyatt and another operator flanked the bed, pressing their weight onto the dying man's shoulders and uninjured leg. I didn't hesitate. I drove the thick needle straight down into the chest cavity. There was a distinct sickening pop as the needle pierced the pleura. Immediately, a violent hiss of trapped air escaped the catheter, followed by a spray of pink aerated blood that hit the front of my blue scrubs. The smell of iron hit my nostrils thick and heavy. The man on the bed, his name tape read. Hayes sucked in a massive, ragged breath. The terrifying blue tint around his lips began to recede, replaced by a dull, mottled gray. His trachea, which had been visibly pushed to the left side of his throat by the pressure in his chest, slowly began to shift back to the center. "O2 sats are coming up," Dr. Chen whispered from the corner. He was staring at the monitor, sounding completely bewildered. "Heart rate is stabilizing. It's a temporary fix," I said, my voice hoarse. The initial adrenaline was leveling out into a cold, hyper-focused tunnel vision. He needs a chest tube. Now. Where is that scalpel? Nancy pointed a shaking finger at the tray. I grabbed the blade. I didn't have lidocaine. I didn't have time to prep the site. I found the 5th intercostal space, just anterior to the mid-axillary line. Hayes, I am so sorry, I muttered. I made the incision. Blood welled up instantly, dark and fast. I dropped the scalpel, grabbed a pair of curved Kelly forceps, and shoved them brutally into the incision, spreading the muscle and tissue. It is an ugly, violent procedure. It looks like butchery. To the civilian staff watching, I was mutilating a man. To Wyatt and his team, I was doing the only thing that mattered. I pushed my gloved index finger into the hole, feeling the hot, slick edge of the rib and the squishy resistance of the lung beneath. I swept my finger in a circle, clearing the clots. Hayes groaned a deep guttural sound of agony that vibrated through the mattress, but the operators held him pinned. Tube, I snapped, holding out my bloody hand. Dr. Aris finally moved. He ripped open a 36 French chest tube and slapped it into my palm. He didn't speak. He just watched his mouth slightly open as I clamped the end of the thick plastic tube with the forceps and drove it into the pleural space. I aimed posterior and superior, feeding it deep into the chest cavity. Dark, thick blood instantly rushed through the plastic tubing. Connect him to the pleurivac, I told Chen. The resident scrambled to attach the suction unit. The machine gurgled to life, pulling the blood and air out of Hayes's chest. I stepped back. My hands were coated in blood up to the wrists. My knees were shaking so hard I had to lock them to stay standing. The roar in my ears was deafening, blocking out the hum of the fluorescent lights, the beeping of the monitors, and the frantic radio chatter coming from Wyatt's shoulder mic. I looked down at Hayes. His chest was rising and falling in a steady, even rhythm. The tourniquet on his leg was holding. He was unconscious deeply under, but he was alive. The spell broke. The bubble popped. Dr. Aris suddenly snapped back into his role as the attending physician. All right, let's move. We need to transport him to OR1, Page Trauma Surgery. Tell them we have an amputee with a stabilized sucking chest wound. Let's go. Let's go. The civilian nurses jolted from their paralysis, surged forward. They took control of the gurney, pushing the operators aside. Wyatt let them. His men stepped back, forming a loose perimeter around the bed, their eyes still scanning the hospital as if expecting an ambush. They rolled Hayes out of the ER, the squeak of the wheels fading down the long, sterile hallway. I didn't follow them. I stood in the middle of Bay 1, staring at the puddle of blood on the floor. It was reflecting the harsh overhead lights. My blue scrubs were ruined, stained with a dark, sprawling Rorschach test of combat trauma. The ER was suddenly very quiet. Nancy was standing by the charge desk, clutching a clipboard to her chest like a shield. She looked at me, her expression a messy mixture of awe, horror, and profound confusion. I didn't look back. I turned and walked toward the sluice room. I pushed the door open with my elbow and kicked it shut behind me. The room smelled like bleach and old urine. It was perfect. I walked over to the deep steel sink, turned the faucet on full blast, and shoved my hands under the scalding water. I grabbed the rough pumice soap and scrubbed. I scrubbed until my skin was raw, until the water running down the drain turned from crimson to pale pink, and finally to clear. But I couldn't wash the smell away. The copper was stuck in my sinuses. My left knee gave out. I didn't fall, but I slumped heavily against the edge of the sink, gripping the cold steel to keep myself upright. I squeezed my eyes shut, fighting the sudden violent urge to vomit. Just a float, nurse. The mantra tasted like ash in my mouth. The heavy door creaked open. I didn't turn around. I knew the heavy, deliberate tread of those boots. Wyatt stepped into the small room. He looked huge in the confined space, his tactical gear scraping against the plastic bins. He smelled like sweat, aviation fuel, and cordite. He smelled like a world I had spent 3 years trying to forget. He didn't say anything at first. He just walked over to the paper towel dispenser, pulled out a long sheet, and handed it to me. I took it, drying my raw, trembling hands. Dispatch said the nearest level 1 trauma center was 20 mics out, Wyatt said. His voice was a low rumble, devoid of the aggressive edge it had in the ER. Hayes didn't have 20 mics. He had maybe 5. I kept my eyes on the drain. You bypassed protocol. You violated airspace. You stormed a civilian hospital. I knew you were here, Wyatt replied simply. I finally turned to look at him. His face was caked in dirt, his beard matted. His eyes were deeply tired, etched with the kind of exhaustion that sleep never touches. I'm not Whiskey 6 anymore, Wyatt, I said, my voice barely a whisper. I'm Harper. I empty bedpans. I cover lunch breaks. I hide. You can call yourself whatever you want, Dusty, Wyatt said, leaning against the doorframe. You can wear those ugly blue scrubs and pretend you don't know how to save a life when the world is ending. But muscle memory doesn't lie. When the shit hit the fan, you didn't run. You commanded the room. I hated every second of it, I lied. Wyatt smiled. It was a sad, knowing smile. No, you didn't. You hated the blood. You hated the reminder, but you didn't hate the work. You're the best trauma medic I ever saw in the sandbox. That doesn't just wash off in a hospital sink. He pushed himself off the doorframe. He reached into one of his utility pouches and pulled out a small, blood-stained fabric patch. It was a subdued American flag with a tiny embroidered skull in the corner. Whiskey 6. He set it on the edge of the sink, right next to the harsh institutional soap. Hayes is going to live, Wyatt said. Because of you. Again. If you want to go back to being a ghost, I won't stop you. We'll get out of your hair. He turned and pushed the door open. Wyatt, I called out. He stopped, looking back over his shoulder. Tell Hayes he owes me a new pair of scrubs, I said. A genuine tired grin broke through Wyatt's grim expression. I'll tell him. Good to see you, Dusty. The door swung shut, leaving me alone in the sluice room. I stared at the patch on the sink. The fabric was stiff with dried blood. I didn't touch it. I left it sitting there, a loud, undeniable monument to the things I couldn't bury. I took a deep breath, the smell of bleach finally overtaking the copper. I smoothed down the front of my ruined scrubs, ran a hand through my messy hair, and walked back out into the emergency department. The Black Hawks were already gone. The vibration had faded from the concrete, leaving behind the steady, abrasive hum of the fluorescent lights. The civilian staff was huddled near the nurse's station. Nancy was on the phone, looking pale and thoroughly defeated. Dr. Chen was standing by the trauma bay, staring at the empty bed and the discarded medical wrappers. They all turned to look at me as I walked out. Nobody spoke. The silence was thick, heavy, with unspoken questions they were too terrified to ask. I wasn't the float nurse anymore. I was a stranger. I was a weapon they didn't know how to categorize. I walked past them, my shoes sticking slightly to the floor. I stopped at the isolation cart outside Bay 3. I picked up the stack of N95 masks I had dropped when the helicopters arrived. Nancy slowly lowered the phone. Harper, the hospital administration wants to... They want to talk to you. I didn't look at her. I opened the top drawer of the cart and neatly arranged the masks inside. Tell them I'm on my break, I said, my voice perfectly flat. And when I get back, someone needs to clean up Bay 1. I don't do the heavy lifting. I just float. If Harper's story of hidden scars and unyielding courage kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs a reminder that our past doesn't break us, it builds us. Subscribe to the channel for more deeply human raw stories that strip away the ordinary and dive into the extraordinary reality of frontline heroes. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in her shoes? Stay tuned for more.